Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. Nintendo finally loosened their policy on nuking videos from orbit if they so much as dare mention their games, so let's return to partially familiar territory for me with the first Fire Emblem game to release in the West, or as it's known in Japan, the Blazing Blade. It's interesting to look at how long Fire Emblem has been going in Japan, as while the Blazing Blade is the first one that was introduced to the Western market, this is technically the 7th one in the franchise. To my knowledge, there was a lot of skepticism as to whether a turn-based strategy game would see success within the West, and as such, they preferred to take the gamble with a game like Advance Wars, where the amount of time required to localize it would be far less overall. Beyond that, they would also have another unexpected reason to bring it over following the release of Super Smash Bros. Melee, as at the behest of the localization team, Roy and Marth were kept in the Western release, marking the first time that anyone outside of Japan had ever seen Fire Emblem characters firsthand, apart from maybe the dedicated weeb or two. Given the financial success of Advance Wars and the newfound interest in the Fire Emblem franchise, this led to the Blazing Blade becoming the first Fire Emblem game to be released in the West, albeit without the subtitle. For my part, this is an interesting game for me to look back on because it's part of a genre that I was both experienced with at a young age and yet seldom dipped into outside of a couple of key moments. The first of these was Shining Force, a name which I could never remember until recently, but with a core gameplay loop that I really liked back in the day, even if the game is really basic by modern standards. The second was Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones, after a friend recommended it to me, a game which I remember fondly and really need to dig back out. However, as time wore on, I ended up not playing any more of the Fire Emblem franchise despite hearing good things about it, in part because most of the remaining games were made for devices we didn't own. By the time we could theoretically throw money at new handheld devices, we already had laptops we could bring for road trips, and since I grew up on PC gaming, I ended up sticking to what was more familiar and overall cheaper. As such, if I was going to return to Fire Emblem, it made sense for me to look at the Blazing Blade first, as it's fairly similar to what I've already played, and because I knew the only localization issues would be brought on by the developers rather than by a fan-made translation. The question then becomes whether it was worth looking back on after all these years, so without further ado, let's dive into it. The story and gameplay receive about the same level of focus, so let's arbitrarily start with the gameplay. For anyone unfamiliar with SRPGs, they are turn-based strategy games where you're given a team of characters and are asked to complete a given objective. These objectives range from seizing a specific tile to defeating every enemy on the field to surviving for a set number of turns. To make it more interesting and complicated, the game gives you a substantial roster of characters, each with their own strengths, weaknesses, history, and personalities. The most prominent differences are weapon and magical proficiency, as the game relies on rock-paper-scissors balance for both. For martial weapons, lance beats sword, sword beats axe, and axe beats lance, while for magical weapons, arcana beats light, light beats dark, and dark beats arcana. And while this might be simple on the outset, the game has a ton of other little nuances that will affect everything from who you bring into a fight and what weapons they have equipped. For instance, flying units like Pegasus Knights are unaffected by terrain and are more resilient against magic, but are incredibly vulnerable to bows and ballistae, while heavily armored units might be resilient against physical weapons, but are slow-moving and weak against magic. Also, while it might be possible to take someone out despite having a weapon disadvantage, you have to be mindful as to the risk of that action, as not only is there a chance to miss or land a critical hit, enemies will also counterattack if you hit them in range of their currently equipped weapon. This adds its own little thing to consider, as if you have a bow equipped and someone walks up to you, they can get a free hit off without fear of reproach, adding something else to consider if you have a character who can use both melee and ranged weapons. If I wanted to list all of the little strengths and weaknesses, I could spend the next 5 minutes detailing them, but thankfully for anyone concerned about the complexity, the game does a really good job at easing you into it. Before throwing you into the main game, it breaks up the story between a pseudo-tutorial campaign where it relies more on character interactions and direct tutorials, before throwing you into the deep end with the main story. Most of what you'll need to know going into this game will be answered by the time you finish that campaign. And while there is still plenty of nuance to introduce later on, it's really well paced, if a little slow for someone who has played a game like this already. However, there is the elephant in the room whenever I talk about SRPGs, specifically the disconnect between the core gameplay loop and the reward system. Whenever I think about game design, much of my thought process is geared towards encouraging the player to act in a way that will help them be successful at whatever is presented. When it comes to a turn-based strategy game, the overarching goal is to defeat your opponent in the most effective way possible, which typically means remaining grouped, letting your most powerful units take the brunt of an enemy offensive, and isolating targets in order to take them down before they have a chance to respond. However, the reward system that SRPGs use doesn't necessarily encourage that kind of approach. To give a brief overview, every time a character lands a hit, deals the killing blow, or heals another character, they will gain experience. The amount of experience you earn depends on a number of factors, with a missed strike or one that you can't react to only rewarding 1 XP, successful hits rewarding experience based on the damage dealt and relative level of both units, and killing blows giving substantially more, up to a cap of 100. Once that a character is level 10 or above, they can then be promoted by using a special item, which gives them a serious power boost and often allows them to use another kind of weapon or magic. This will give them more power and more versatility, though it will also mean they gain less experience from taking on units who haven't been promoted, even if said units are at a relatively high level. On the surface, it's a standard reward system for any kind of RPG, but the problem lies in the fact that playing to ensure your characters get enough experience to carry on, versus playing to efficiently defeat an opponent, are very different circumstances. If you play according to the latter, you will eventually have a power disparity between your characters brought on by who is in the front to deal the killing blow. As a result, you end up in a rich get richer scenario, where the characters who are able to hold their own will end up facing down more people, which means they get more experience, all the while other characters are neglected to where it's almost not worth keeping them on the field. This then leads into the question of whether the disconnect poses a problem with this game in particular. The last time I reviewed an SRPG, there wasn't enough information readily available to where it was difficult to keep track of your character's levels, which was further compounded by a much stricter turn order that didn't give you much room to adjust even if you did have that information. Going into this game in particular, I was concerned by the fact that there isn't a discrete place where you can grind, save for the occasional arena where you can risk your character's lives for coin and experience. That would then mean if the disconnect became an issue or the game balance was off in some way, then it would be a point of unnecessary frustration. That being said, I'm glad to report that my concern wasn't unfounded but wasn't that big of a deal, as a result of the solid UI. Want to look at all of the units you have and sort them based on level? Hit A on an unoccupied space, select unit, and you've got more stats than you can shake a sword at. Want to know if moving to a particular square will put you in range of an enemy next turn? Select the enemy you're worried about and find out. Getting tired of all of the talking and want to continue on with zero context? I mean, the start button is right there, so you do you, man, and I get doing that if you have to start a scenario over and don't need to reread all of that, but come on, the story's half the fun, as we'll discuss later. The only thing that isn't here is an efficient way to see what everyone's inventory looks like at a glance, which would have been really useful to have when it comes to opening chests and doors. You can at least hit the right bumper to get more information on a particular unit, which does allow you to see both stats and inventories, but again, there isn't an easy way to see items in bulk, at least for units that are currently on the field. Because of how good the UI is, and because of how easy it is to assess the strength of your characters, the disconnect may still be present, but it's compartmentalized into something to keep track of rather than a nuisance to work against. I did still have characters who ended up stronger than others to where one of my axe users could fend off entire waves of units without breaking a sweat, but given that he's one of the main characters and someone who I always brought into battle with me, that's on me for letting him become that much of a badass. Besides, it let me be careless when the number of enemies started ratcheting up, so who am I to complain about good fortune? Which brings me neatly into discussing the difficulty curve, which is properly ramped up throughout but might seem too easy at first glance. If you had no knowledge of Fire Emblem and I told you that I got through most fights without losing a character, you might think the difficulty was set too low and that hard mode shouldn't have been locked behind completing the game on normal difficulty. To be fair, I do agree with that second point, as apart from one or two moments I didn't feel as challenged as I might have hoped, but with respect to the first point, I would agree that it would be too easy if the game didn't feature permadeath. If you lose a character in the starting campaign, you'll see them again for the main campaign, but once you're in the main game and they get knocked to zero, they're dead, and there's nothing you can do about it besides starting over. Granted, there are some characters such as the Traveling Merchant who can't be killed outright, and if you lose one of the main characters you'll get a game over screen and have to start over anyway, but if you lose anyone else and decide to keep going, there's no reviving them later, and even if they stay alive for story reasons, you aren't using them anymore. Because of that, the failure state may technically be losing a main character, but it definitely doesn't feel good to lose anyone else, which means the game is balanced around doing your best to keep everyone alive, adding further incentive to build up every character so they have the best possible odds of sticking around. However, bear in mind that losing a character and needing to start over can negatively affect the pacing, as when you're going through the same or similar scenario due to losing someone once or twice, it can become very repetitive very quickly. Granted, it's your own fault for having that happen, and the frustration I felt at the game was likely a way to keep from being too frustrated at myself, so there's only so much I can complain, but bear that in mind if you like taking risks. I can understand why you would want to take risks, as it can be really exhilarating when a character narrowly escapes death, but if you play like that, your mileage will vary. When it comes to probability in this game, the numbers do not lie. So if there is an 80% chance to hit, you will come across the 1 in 5 where you will miss. And that is something you'll need to factor into your strategy. Thankfully, you can take away the battle animations if you want to cycle through the battles more quickly, a fact that made getting through the game a lot easier when I tried out the hard mode and alternate campaign. Speaking of which, after you've beaten the game, you're given the option to skip the tutorial campaign, as well as try out an alternate mode where the leading lord's friend is at the forefront instead of him. The story is pretty much the same, but there are a few places where it focuses on this other character, and after playing through the game once, it will fill in some of the gaps if you're confused by certain events. Unfortunately, skipping right to the main campaign will mean some characters from the starting section will be underleveled, so you'll likely want to go through it again to be safe, but once you reach the end of that section, you can choose which character you want leading you. And once you've completed a certain story, you can then select a hard mode for it, which will lower the number of characters you can bring into battle, reduce the amount of resources you have to replenish your weaponry, and throw more powerful units in your way. For the most part, I think playing through the alternate mode was worth my time, as the added story was appreciated, and even without hard mode added on, the enemy's unit composition is changed up enough to where you're not entirely retreading old ground. It is slightly harder than the original tale, as you're given a couple of extra scenarios, brought to bear against more aggressive AI and seem to have less gold to work with, but for the most part I did have a good time when I went through the alternate mode, apart from the times I got in too much of a hurry and kept losing people due to careless errors. Again though, a point of frustration that is entirely on me. As for hard mode itself, it didn't seem to be too much more difficult than normal mode, but then again I didn't get very far in it past the starting campaign, so that could just be a result of not spending enough time with it. Regardless, since I mentioned gold recently, that's another thing to keep track of, because weapons don't come cheap, and every single one of them has a set number of uses. Each time you land a blow with an item, it will lose a point of durability, meaning you'll have to visit armories to replenish weapons, and vendors to replenish consumable items, magical tomes, and staves. What this system allows, however, is for characters to equip multiple versions of a given weapon type, with most fitting into a fairly consistent pattern with slim, iron, steel, and silver variants. Generally, when moving up the scale, they'll do more damage but be less likely to hit, less likely to critically strike, and require higher weapon proficiency, a stat which is built up by a character consistently using a certain weapon type. There are also weapons with a higher chance to critically strike, ranged versions of the lance and axe that can still be used in melee range, versions of the weapons which are guaranteed to strike twice without worrying about a character's speed stat, and special weapons that can reach halfway across the map or are specific to a certain character. For the most part, I never had an issue with weapon and gold management, as even when money was tight, I almost always had enough weapon uses to get by, even for the alternate mode where they start you out with a little less. Regardless, the weapon variety and the relative scarcity of some of them meant that even for characters whose only concern is to use one kind of weapon, there's a lot to consider beyond just moving into range to strike. Do you use a weaker weapon to set up a kill for a weaker unit, taking into account the enemies remaining? Do you rely on a more potent or exotic weapon now and hope that you can either buy or find more of that weapon later? Since the weapons also have a certain weight to them, that will also affect whether you can attack twice in one turn. So do you use an iron sword to get 2 strikes in, or a steel one with a more powerful single strike? And when it comes to this game, that tactical consideration is where it really shines, as when combined with the solid game balance and the need to think not only turns ahead but battles ahead, the gears are constantly turning. And when you're victorious, it's really satisfying due to the work you put into it. So with the combat in good shape, all that remains to be seen is whether the story is able to hold its own, so let's take a closer look at it. The tutorial campaign begins with a young woman named Lynn coming across a tactician named Self-Insert. And it's here where I'll admit to being nervous about the game's story, as I'm really torn as to whether a self-insert protagonist was warranted, especially in a game like this where everyone has a distinct and memorable personality. On one hand, because the onus is on us as the player to fill in the gaps whenever a character is speaking to us, and especially when they respond to us as if we said something, there's a sense of awkwardness from both being involved in the story and yet not being able to directly interact. Regardless of the reason for the self-insert, since that I have no direct input over his actions, it creates an artificial disconnect that can be off-putting at best and immersion-breaking at worst. If you're going to create a self-insert for me to take the role of, then it would have been nice to have been able to, well, play the role of that self-insert, especially since he's seen as a vital part of the group. Even if something like dialogue options wouldn't necessarily have an effect on the story, it would have been nice to have at least been given the illusion of choice, along with a more direct way to interact with the characters. On the other hand, despite my issues with the self-insert, I'm not sure how they would get rid of him without creating more issues than it solves, in large part because he's integrated so well. Having Lynn assist us after finding us collapsed on the side of the road gives her, and by extension the player, a perfect opportunity to introduce herself and to give us a sense for her personality and history. A similar effect could have been made if she were monologuing, but adding any other character into the mix, even a flat board like the self-insert, completely changes the dynamic. Now when she informs us of the fact that her tribe was attacked and her parents killed, it's not a moment of internal weakness before facing the world, it's a matter of opening up to a stranger after being alone for so long, which makes the story more personal and leads one to be more sympathetic to Lynn's plight. From there, it also gives her a chance to show her compassionate side, as in the first battle they set it up as being a close scrape, but instead of being concerned for her own life, her worry is instead on the fact that you would have been far worse off had she been killed. Had there not been someone there, the focus would have likely shifted more towards showing reservation and distrust of others, which would have completely changed the context of the next chapter. Granted, given the next two characters we meet, having her be distrustful could have still worked, but it's not the only time where the self-insert's presence changes the social dynamic, both in Lynn's campaign and in the main story. In fact, when the transition happens between the two, the self-insert is part of the connecting tissue, as after interacting with us, the leading lord, namely Ellawood, is more willing to trust us for when the story picks up. Because of that, I think the story would have been worse off if the self-insert were removed, though the fact that we don't get to do any role-playing with said insert is a disappointment. Which might be why there was no self-insert in the Sacred Stones, though to be fair, that fact might be part of the reason why I find it so off-putting here. I mean, if you could pull off the early dynamic by contrasting Seth and Erica in the Sacred Stones, why not do something similar here with a character that Lynn might know? You could keep a similar context by having her open up to someone, and get to see how another character responds to her plight at the same time. Point being, I get why the self-insert is there, I just wish someone else had been there, or that we had some degree of input ourselves. Regardless, let's get into the story itself, as following our introduction to Lynn, we then visit the central trading hub of the Sakai Plains, or however you pronounce that, and run across an overly romantic knight named Sane and his straight-laced companion named Kent. After a failure to communicate leads Lynn to storm off, we find ourselves beset by bandits who refer to Lynn as Lindis, with the two knights we ran into earlier realizing what's going on and helping us fend them off. Following this, they say they are knights in the service of a Lycian noble named Marquess Kalen, and were sent here to look for Lynn specifically. Though Lynn had no knowledge of this, her mother was Kalen's daughter, but after a familial dispute, she had chosen to leave her father's home to marry a nomad in the plains, where Lynn had lived all her life. At the time, Kalen had disowned his daughter, but upon hearing that she had a daughter of her own, and had named her Lindis in honor of Kalen's late wife, now he was eager to see his granddaughter for the first time, especially since he was growing old and only had one other living relative. A relative who was not that big of a fan given that Lynn's existence is a threat to his inheritance of Kalen's estate. And it is at this point where the greatest strength and weakness of the game is made apparent. In terms of weakness, there is a lot of talking that happens in this game before, during, and after a scenario, which can come across as a bit much at times. It does get better as the combat sections become more advanced and therefore take more time to get through, but throughout your time with this game, there is a lot of dialogue to sift through. However, this didn't bother me all that much for two reasons. First off, the world building is excellent. Though my focus in this review is on being concise and will therefore present a lot to take in all at once, there is a ton of intrigue, world building, characterization, and more to where the amount of time spent with the story is absolutely warranted. Whether it be a matter of political and social intrigue as you learn about who's in charge at what part of the continent, or just laughing at and alongside the characters, you end up with a world that's a lot of fun to explore. More importantly, the game recognizes that all of it is being delivered from the perspective of a spoken character, and does an excellent job to reflect that character's personality and motivations while still being informative. Sane, for instance, will be very chipper and speak in a way that's very grandiose and flowery, while Kent will be more straight to the point and formal, telling us a lot about both characters without their personalities being directly stated. Second, the simpler presentation may be off-putting to some because of how basic it is now, but I actually find it rather charming. Before I say why I like it though, I will admit that because there's no tone of voice and not that many facial expressions, it can sometimes be difficult to read a situation. For instance, after Lynn's story is resolved, your journey follows two young nobles, Eliwood, who is searching for his missing father, and a friend of his called Hector, both of whom end up roped into another matter concerning the entire continent. While they are traveling, they find themselves passing through Caitlyn's territory, which leads them to comment on what happened in the starting campaign a year prior. Naturally, since Eliwood met Lynn at one point during that adventure, Hector is curious to know if she is, quote, a beauty. When reading the answer though, it isn't necessarily clear whether the response was an attempt to be diplomatic about someone he doesn't think looks attractive, or if he doesn't want to admit how he really feels. We may have had some hints before, given how Sane was eager to speak highly of her appearance, but since he's a sweet talker that does this with every woman he comes across, all we've got to work from is his flattery and our own opinion. That means it isn't until the final word finishes scrolling that we realize it's the latter. However, despite this weakness, I did say that I like the presentation, and one of the main reasons for that is because of the artwork and music. Though the character portraits don't change all that much, everyone does look distinct, and the backdrops are really well drawn. The music is really good as well, as it sets the perfect tone whenever you're in a bit of dialogue, it's conspicuously absent for quiet moments that only need a bit of ambience, and sets a solid contrast between the enemy's turn and your own. To go off on a small tangent, the audio design is also fairly solid, as there's a surprising amount of impact built into dealing a killing blow or critical hit, to say nothing of the flourishes that happened beforehand. Honestly, with how they look, the only reason the combat animation ever got old was because of the times when I had to start a chapter over. But even then, it's hard to go wrong with the music that plays when you initiate combat. Honestly, they should have had that as the boss fight music instead of the standard combat music, because it ironically has a more epic and upbeat feel than the boss fight music does. Regardless, that's more for the presentation during the gameplay section, so when it comes to the dialogue before and after combat, I find it charming, funnily enough, because it's so simple. Since there's no voice acting or tone of voice, it's left to your imagination to fill in the blanks, to mentally picture what the character sounds like and come up with the proper tone of voice and body language that you think is the most compelling. Going back to the point when Hector and Eliwood were discussing Lynn, I might have been unsure at first as to what was going on, but once it all clicked and after a brief back and forth, you realize that Hector is taking this as an opportunity for some good-natured teasing. It's not just dialogue on the screen that's sometimes punctuated by different sentence structure. It's brought to life in my mind as I'm seeing Eliwood's eyes widen a bit as he reacts to the blunt question, hesitating a little bit as he responds, only for Hector to immediately notice the change in his friend's attitude and set a trap by saying, "Too bad, isn't it?" without specifying why. Which naturally leads Eliwood to ask what he means, perhaps concerned or merely curious, at which point Hector swoops in for the killing blow by saying, "Too bad we don't have time to see her, lover boy." Admittedly, the writing is a little stilted at times, and in this case it's a small interaction that doesn't have a grand effect on the narrative, unless you want it to, but it gives us a glimpse into who they are as people and helps us to get invested in their fate once the plot picks up steam. Granted though, what I just described is very subjective, and by this standard I could get enjoyment out of pretty much anything. However, I feel justified in bringing it up because while your mileage may vary, the game itself gives you more than enough material to get the gears turning, both through how each character speaks and through some very well placed artwork. Perhaps the best example of this was after a bit of chicanery in Lynn's story, where after a couple of other people joined their merry band, Sane made a comment about how they were all welcome cohorts in Lady Lindis's Legion, done in a manner that made one of them slightly nervous, all accompanied by artwork to perfectly express Kent's reaction. So while it might be more simplistic than we might find nowadays, the game throws more than enough at you to where it's very easy to extrapolate, especially given how much variety there is between all of the characters. Heck, with just this one picture, you have the helpless romantic, his straight-laced companion, a caring lady-to-be, her shy childhood friend, and a stranger looking to make something of himself, to say nothing as to the highly amusing cleric and mage pairing you run into a couple of chapters later. There is so much packed into every little detail that it's really impressive. However, not everything is sunshine and rainbows, and I'm not just talking about what happens in the game itself, as there are a couple of issues that need to be addressed. First off, there are the support conversations. For the unfamiliar, in order to flesh out the characters without distracting from the main plot, you can unlock conversations between two characters by consistently ending your turn with them next to each other. Each character can have up to 5 conversations throughout the entire game, with a maximum of 3 conversations between 2 people specifically. There are some restrictions as to who can converse with who, but they're a welcome addition for a couple of reasons. For one thing, it's another small intricacy to consider when you're figuring out unit placement, as if you're able to get these conversations going, it will give some small benefit during combat. Second, it allows you to effectively engage in shipping between characters without ever leaving the game itself, as if you're able to get the third conversation between two characters, their future after the game may be linked in some way. It's not a guarantee, but hey, might as well investigate it when you're able, right? In principle, it's a really great system to get around the fact that you run into a ton of characters for the sake of the gameplay, and won't necessarily have time for all of them in the main story, therefore letting you pick and choose the characters you're most interested in at the same time. However, while it's a major strength, it's also a potential weakness, as irrespective of all the possibilities, there's sometimes the sense that in the moment something is missing. In my first playthrough, I only got the third conversation between two people, and wasn't able to explore the supports very much outside of that pairing either. Granted, I did make more of a concerted effort when I played Hector's story, but it then creates a weird expectation that if you want to see everything on offer, you better be willing to replay the game a fair amount. And since I've been a one-and-done gamer as of late, it's left characters seemingly underdeveloped because, of all the things to keep track of, the support conversations are often the last on my list. Bear in mind though that this was my personal experience, as while there is a lot that can be unfurled, and plenty to read if you want to look them up without actively seeking them out, it ended up being a lower priority in the moment, and led the ending to be less satisfying than I had hoped. As for the second issue, you have the inconsistent stakes. While the game shows no mercy during the second half, there was more than one point in the first half where there was one too many coincidences, one too many lucky breaks, and one too many people acting strangely incompetent for the sake of either plot convenience or a satisfying payoff. To go into further detail on both the good and the bad, however, I'll need to venture into spoiler territory. If you haven't played this game, then I strongly encourage you to follow the timestamp to my final thoughts, as there is plenty that I'm about to discuss that is worth seeing for yourself. When it comes to the lack of stakes in the first half, that issue is best exemplified with Marquez Kalen, as it seems like no permanent harm can ever come to him. First, you have the matter of his brother slowly poisoning him, when you think a dagger to the heart would make a lot more sense. However, because they went the poisoning route, not only was he able to survive when Kalen's brother should have easily been able to kill him before Lynn arrived, now Lynn can give the whole will to live speech so that we can have our happy ending. I mean, at this point, I'm not sure if we're playing Fire Emblem or Undertale. Thankfully, at least at first, we then have the point where someone actually acts smart and does go the dagger route, when disaster befalls Castle Kalen once again. It creates a desire for revenge to motivate us as the player to push in and give them hell, and gives Lynn sufficient motivation to become very invested in seeing the Black Fang get raked over the coals for this. But then we learn that the person who is supposed to finish him off is actually a spy called Layla, who is working for Marquez Ostia, i.e. Hector's brother, i.e. someone who can whisk the Marquez away where he can be treated for his injuries and somehow recover, even though we never see him again, and any mention of Kalen beyond that point speaks of him as if he passed away, which he most certainly did at some point, but to where it's unclear as to when that happened. If he had actually been killed, that would have been a really impactful moment by virtue of everything I just described. But by sheer luck, oh look, here's an Ostian spy to bail him out, a spy who just so happens to be friends with our other spy friend, because that's totally not going to have ramifications later given how much plot armor Marquez Kalen has. What's next? She goes somewhere, gets discovered, and we manage to save her after she narrowly... Oh, crap. Well, never mind then. It looks like the stakes are actually there now. People can die, and will die. Now I have reason to worry about Ellawood's father, since now I don't know if he's going the route of Layla or Marquez Kalen. And in that case, it was the Ostian spy, in what was one of the more heartfelt and somber moments in the game. Okay, the gloves are off, ladies and gentlemen. The gloves are officially off. And from there, the stakes remain consistently high from beginning to end. Even as we see the good and bad of the groups we fight against, even as more is revealed about each character and we learn about tales both epic and tragic, man does it know how to hit you hard. And when it comes to hitting you hard, Ninian's death was probably the most powerful. Up to that point, we had seen Ninian get to know Ellawood, maybe even to the point of falling in love. But then for Ellawood to unknowingly strike her down was just... oof. It was something I should have seen coming, but for whatever reason when that happened, I got completely blindsided. Granted, she does end up coming back, but good God, within that moment, to be struck down by a friend before that friend realized what he had done. contrasted with the rest of the game by slowing down the text to normal speed and taking away our ability to control it. A risky move, and one that was still somber despite Ninian being revived, but one that allowed the weight of what just occurred to really sink in. Even going through that a second time and knowing what's coming, it didn't lose any of the impact. And with how dark it could get, between Nergal's depravity and everything involving Sonia and Nino, man was that happy ending earned. And I'll admit that I was kind of sad to see the self-insert leave, and then to never return, as if it was the last time we ever would interact with that world, as if something special truly was over. I mean, the sequel bait is a little annoying, but everything up to that point was spectacular. And on an unrelated side note, I like to take digs at sequel bait no matter what the circumstances, but it was still a nice way to tie the story back into the Binding Blade, especially since that game had released in Japan before the Blazing Blade was. I know that the game was never localized, despite that being the plan way back when, but after seeing the sequel bait, and after getting the B-rank conversation between Eliwood and Hector, I am really interested in seeing how that game plays out. In part because I want to know what the hell happened to Zephiel that made him go full Prince Lion. I've already got the next 2 or 3 games I'm reviewing planned out, including the 3 houses, but once I'm done with those, remind me to set time aside for the Binding Blade. I definitely need to see how that one plays out. Overall, I'm really glad I decided to play this. I'll admit that it's not a perfect game, as it can sometimes be repetitive, the stakes seem to be artificial at times, and the disconnect between the core gameplay loop and the reward system is still present. However, it's hard for me to complain about that when I was having such a good time throughout. The characters were entertaining, the game balance remained in good shape despite the aforementioned disconnect, and when the game wanted to hit you hard, it pulled no punches. I'll admit that I'm certainly biased in that I really wanted to like this game, as in many ways it felt like I was replaying the Sacred Stones, but as an introduction to the franchise for a Western audience, it is certainly a good one, and one that I definitely recommend. If you're interested, it's sadly not being sold anymore, but if you still have a Game Boy lying around, it's definitely worth hunting for an old copy if you can find it. And if not, I'll leave a link to the emulator I used to gather footage in the description below. That's all I have for this video, thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for the next game and Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a not-so-regular basis. Since my upload schedule is highly irregular and contingent on how lengthy a particular game I'm reviewing is, please consider hitting the notifications bell so that you'll be notified whenever I make the mistake of uploading another video. Also, feel free to let me know what you think in the comments below, especially with respect to the title of this video. Since it's the first one to release in the West, I'm tempted to go with the release year instead of the subtitle, but since most fans know it as the Blazing Blade, I'm thinking that might be better in order to appease the YouTube algorithm. I'm sure I'll have a decision by the time I finish the video editing portion, but for now, let me know of your opinion on that, and anything else you have in mind in the comments below, and I'll see you all later.